Los Angeles, March 8, 2023. Evan Brooks, a 55-year-old real estate powerhouse, was found dead in his home office under mysterious circumstances. The scene pointed to a struggle, but investigators soon uncovered inconsistencies that suggested something far more deliberate. The only person home at the time was his wife, Margaret, raising immediate questions about what really happened that night. Evan's death sent shockwaves through his circle of friends and colleagues. He was the kind of guy people envied, successful, charismatic, and seemingly living the dream. But as detectives dug deeper, they uncovered secrets that showed his life wasn't as perfect as it seemed. To figure out how it all went so wrong, you've got to go back and see where the cracks really started. Evan Brooks wasn't just successful. He was the guy everyone wanted to be. He had charm, ambition, and a knack for making the impossible happen. His multimillion-dollar real estate empire was built on hard work and his ability to read people. Clients trusted him, competitors respected him, and his name carried weight across Los Angeles. His mansion in Brentwood was the centerpiece of a life filled with luxury cars, high-profile parties, and exotic vacations. Margaret Brooks had been there through all of it. She and Evan met when they were both young, before the money and the mansions, when Evan was just an ambitious dreamer. Back then, Margaret saw a man with big plans and even bigger drive. She threw herself into helping him succeed, taking care of everything at home so Evan could focus on his career. Their partnership worked for a while. Margaret had a natural grace that complemented Evan's energy. She hosted dinner parties, managed their social calendar, and made sure every detail of their life reflected the image Evan wanted to project. She believed they were a team, that she was as much a part of Evan's success as he was. But as the years went by and Evan's empire grew, Margaret started to feel like her role in their life was shrinking. Evan became more focused on his work and less on her. She chalked it up to stress. After all, running a business wasn't easy. But over time, the distance between them became harder to ignore. At first, it was just little things. Evan stopped asking for her opinion about the business or the house. He started traveling more, spending long stretches in places like Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, supposedly to explore international markets. He'd come back with stories of late-night meetings and big opportunities, but something about the way he spoke felt rehearsed. Then there were the phone calls. Late at night, after Margaret had gone to bed, she'd hear him pacing in his office, speaking in hushed tones. If she asked about it the next morning, he'd wave her off. Just business, he'd say. Margaret tried not to let it bother her, but deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The moment that changed everything came one evening over dinner. Evan had just returned from another trip to Sao Paulo, and Margaret was asking about it when he mentioned a name, Sophia. It was a slip, barely noticeable, but Margaret caught it. "Who's Sophia?" she asked casually, masking the sharp edge in her voice. Evan hesitated, just for a second, before smiling. "A sommelier," he said. "She recommended this amazing wine we had at dinner." The answer seemed plausible, but Margaret couldn't ignore the way he hesitated. That single moment planted a seed of doubt in her mind, one that quickly began to grow. Over the next few weeks, Margaret started paying closer attention. She noticed receipts for expensive dinners and luxury hotels tucked into Evan's briefcase. One night, while he was asleep, she checked his phone and found a series of texts to a number saved under SJ. The messages were vague, but the tone was unmistakable. This wasn't business. Her suspicions were confirmed when she stumbled across an email chain on Evan's laptop. The sender was Sophia, and the messages were far from professional. Attached were photos of a young, glamorous woman posing with gifts Margaret recognized: jewelry, handbags, even a watch she thought Evan had bought for himself. Margaret was devastated, but her heartbreak quickly turned into anger when she dug deeper. Evan wasn't just having an affair. He was funneling money from their accounts to fund Sophia's lavish lifestyle. Private jets, luxury apartments, designer clothes. It was all being paid for with money Margaret thought was theirs. Then came the ultimate betrayal: divorce papers. Margaret found them hidden in Evan's desk, already drafted and ready to be filed. The documents outlined a plan to cut her out of their finances entirely, leaving her with next to nothing. Evan wasn't just leaving her. He was planning to take everything. The realization hit Margaret like a freight train. The man she had built her life with, the man she thought she knew better than anyone, had been living a double life. And he was preparing to leave her behind without a second thought. Margaret knew she couldn't confront Evan. Not yet. He was too smooth, too calculating. If she tipped her hand too soon, he'd find a way to turn it against her. So she decided to wait, to bide her time and figure out her next move. For the next few weeks, Margaret played the role of the oblivious wife. She smiled at Evan's jokes, kissed him goodbye in the mornings, and pretended she wasn't quietly unraveling the web of lies he'd spun around her. But every moment she spent pretending, she was planning. She began documenting everything: bank statements, receipts, emails. She moved small amounts of money from their joint accounts into an account in her name. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her feel like she had some control. Evan, for his part, seemed completely unaware. He continued his trips to Brazil, his late-night phone calls, and his meetings with Sophia. He acted like everything was normal, like Margaret hadn't already discovered his secrets. But Margaret wasn't the same woman she'd been a few months ago. The betrayal had hardened her, and every day she grew more determined to take control of her own life. The cracks in their marriage were no longer hidden. They were wide open, impossible to ignore. And though neither of them could have predicted what was coming, the stage was already set for everything to fall apart. Margaret Brooks had always prided herself on being able to read people, especially Evan. After 25 years of marriage, she knew his quirks, his moods, and how he handled stress. But the past year had made her question everything she thought she knew about him. The late-night phone calls, the frequent trips to Sao Paulo, and now the luxury purchases she'd stumbled upon were impossible to ignore. The name Sophia had been stuck in her head ever since Evan had casually dropped it over dinner weeks ago. "Sophia loved that wine we had there," he'd said, before quickly brushing it off with an explanation about a sommelier. Margaret had smiled and let it go, but her instincts had kicked in immediately. There was something about the way he said it, like he'd let a secret slip. At first, Margaret tried to push the thought away. She didn't want to believe Evan could be hiding something from her, but the signs were everywhere. The tension in his voice when he took phone calls late at night, the way he'd become more secretive about his travel plans, and the receipts she found for extravagant dinners and boutique hotels, all of it pointed to something more than business. One afternoon, while Evan was at the gym, Margaret made her first move. His briefcase was sitting on the counter, and for the first time in their marriage, she opened it without asking. Inside, she found what she feared: receipts for expensive restaurants and luxury services in Sao Paulo. The receipts were dated during trips when Evan had told her he was tied up in meetings. Margaret felt her stomach churn, but she told herself it wasn't proof of anything yet. Maybe there was an explanation, some legitimate reason for the charges. But deep down, she knew better. The next step was his phone. Margaret had never been the type to snoop, but the knot in her stomach pushed her forward. Late one night, after Evan had fallen asleep, she unlocked his phone and scrolled through his messages. At first, it was nothing out of the ordinary: work updates, group chats, and reminders. Then she saw it, a thread with someone saved as Sophia. Her heart pounded as she opened the conversation. The messages weren't businesslike. They were flirtatious, intimate, and filled with plans for their next meet-up in Sao Paulo. One text from Sophia read, "Can't wait to see you again. Miss you already." Another included a photo of Sophia posing by a pool, her sun-kissed skin glistening, with a caption that said, "Wish you were here." Margaret's hands shook as she read through the thread. It was clear that Sophia wasn't just a fling. She was someone Evan had been seeing for months, if not longer. What stung the most was how open he seemed about it, as if he didn't even care enough to hide it properly. The betrayal felt like a punch to the gut, but what Margaret found next turned her hurt into anger. She began noticing photos of Sophia wearing extravagant gifts, designer handbags, jewelry, and watches that Margaret recognized all too well. One photo showed Sophia wearing a diamond necklace Margaret remembered Evan purchasing. When she'd asked about it, he'd claimed it was for a client as part of a deal. It wasn't just the affair that stung. It was the money. Margaret had always believed their wealth was something they'd built together. She'd sacrificed her own ambitions to support Evan's career, managing their home and social life so he could focus on his business. Now she realized that wealth had been used to bankroll another woman's lifestyle. Margaret couldn't stop herself from digging deeper. She began tracking their financial records, combing through bank statements and account histories. Evan had always managed the finances, but Margaret still had access to their joint accounts. What she found shocked her. Evan had been quietly transferring money into offshore accounts, siphoning funds out of their shared accounts and into holdings Margaret had no control over. These weren't small amounts either. He'd been moving hundreds of thousands of dollars, possibly more, over the past year. It wasn't just reckless spending. It was calculated. The realization hit her hard. Evan wasn't just cheating on her. He was preparing to leave her. The hidden accounts, the lavish spending, and the name Sophia all pointed to one thing: a life Evan was building without her. Margaret spent the next few days in a haze. She went through the motions of her daily life, smiling when Evan spoke to her, nodding along to his stories about work. But inside, she felt like she was falling apart. Then, one afternoon, she found something that confirmed her worst fears. While checking his laptop, Margaret stumbled across a folder labeled Personal. Inside, she found draft divorce papers. The documents outlined a clear plan for Evan to separate from her while keeping the majority of their assets for himself. Margaret read in disbelief as the full extent of his betrayal came into focus. He wasn't just cheating. He was planning to cut her out of their life entirely. Every financial decision he'd made over the past year had been to secure his future without her. Margaret stared at the screen, feeling the weight of 25 years of marriage crashing down around her. She thought about the sacrifices she'd made, the years she'd spent supporting Evan's dreams, and the trust she'd placed in him. It was all a lie. But Margaret wasn't the type to fall apart. As the initial shock wore off, it was replaced by something stronger: resolve. If Evan thought she was going to sit back and let him destroy her life, he didn't know her at all. She began quietly gathering evidence. Every message, every receipt, every suspicious transfer. Margaret documented it all. She took screenshots of his phone, photographed documents, and saved everything to a secure drive. She didn't know exactly what she would do with it, but she knew she needed to protect herself. Evan, for his part, seemed completely unaware. He carried on as if nothing had changed, smiling at Margaret across the dinner table and making phone calls from his office without a care in the world. His arrogance was infuriating, but it also gave Margaret the advantage. The more she uncovered, the clearer Evan's plans became. His financial maneuvers, the draft divorce papers, and his casual attitude all pointed to a man who believed he had complete control. Margaret bided her time, playing the role of the oblivious wife while quietly building her case. She even reached out to an attorney, framing it as a hypothetical situation involving a friend, to learn more about her options. As the weeks went by, Margaret's anger grew. She thought about the years she'd spent building a life with Evan, believing they were a team, only to realize he'd been planning her downfall. But Margaret wasn't going to let him win. Evan had underestimated her. He'd assumed she wouldn't notice, wouldn't question him, and wouldn't fight back. But Margaret was smarter than he gave her credit for, and she was determined to make sure he didn't walk away unscathed. For now, she waited. She watched Evan closely, noting his routines and his behavior. Every detail was a piece of the puzzle, and Margaret was slowly putting it together. Evan thought he was in control, but Margaret was already steps ahead. And when the time came, she'd be ready to show him just how wrong he was. Margaret Brooks stood outside Evan's office, her hands trembling as she gripped the folder containing everything she had uncovered. For weeks, she had played the role of the oblivious wife, smiling through dinners, enduring his dismissive remarks, and watching as he moved through their home with the confidence of a man who thought he'd never be caught. But the folder in her hands told a different story. Inside were receipts for lavish dinners, hotel stays, and extravagant gifts, all tied to the name she couldn't escape: Sophia. There were screenshots of text messages that made her stomach turn, photos of Sophia flaunting jewelry Margaret had once believed Evan had bought for her. The worst of it was the draft divorce papers she'd found on his laptop, meticulously designed to leave her with nothing. Margaret didn't knock before entering. The door swung open, and Evan glanced up from his desk, a glass of bourbon in his hand. He looked more annoyed than concerned, as though she were an interruption rather than his wife of 25 years. She dropped the folder onto his desk, the papers scattering slightly. Evan's expression shifted, but not in the way Margaret had expected. There was no panic, no denial. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. Margaret had always thought of herself as calm and measured, but something about his arrogance pushed her to the edge. The words came tumbling out, about Sophia, the hidden money, the betrayal. She had spent weeks piecing together the truth, and now it was all laid bare. Evan didn't deny any of it. He didn't apologize. Instead, he acted as though her outrage was a minor inconvenience, something he could brush off. His calm indifference stung more than any of the lies. When she left the office, Margaret felt like she was walking in a daze. The confrontation hadn't brought the catharsis she'd hoped for. If anything, it had made things worse. Evan hadn't just betrayed her. He had erased her, dismissed her pain as irrelevant, and made it clear he had no intention of backing down. That night, as Evan slept soundly beside her, Margaret sat alone in the dark living room. She replayed the confrontation over and over in her mind, each word cutting deeper than the last. His threats echoed in her ears. If she fought him, he'd drag her through court, leaving her with nothing. Margaret had spent years believing she and Evan were a team. She had sacrificed her own dreams to support his career, had stood by him through every triumph and every setback. Now, it was clear she had been nothing more than a convenience to him, someone to manage the details of his life while he built his empire. For hours, Margaret sat there, staring out the window as the faint glow of the city lights reflected off the glass. Her emotions churned, hurt, anger, humiliation. But beneath it all, a new feeling began to take root: clarity. Evan had spent months planning to leave her, dismantling their life piece by piece, funneling money into secret accounts, and building a future with Sophia. He had underestimated her at every turn, assuming she would simply accept his betrayal and fade quietly into the background. But Evan didn't know her as well as he thought. Margaret had spent weeks gathering evidence, documenting every receipt, every financial transfer, every message. She had moved carefully, taking small steps to protect herself while Evan continued to believe he was in control. But now, her patience had run out. She thought about the years she had spent by his side, the nights she had stayed up worrying about his business deals, the sacrifices she had made to support his dreams. And for what? To be discarded without a second thought? To be replaced by a younger woman who had done nothing to earn the life Margaret had helped build? The more she thought about it, the more the injustice of it burned. Evan had taken everything from her: her trust, her stability, her sense of self. And he had done it with the casual arrogance of someone who believed he could get away with it. By the time the sun began to rise, Margaret had made her decision. Evan wasn't going to walk away unscathed. She had given him every opportunity to come clean, to make amends, to treat her with the respect she deserved. He had chosen to respond with threats and indifference. Margaret wasn't the same woman she had been weeks ago. The betrayal had hardened her, sharpened her focus, and stripped away any illusions she once had about the man she had married. If Evan thought he was untouchable, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. Over the next few days, Margaret moved with a quiet determination. She continued her usual routines, smiling when Evan walked through the door, making polite conversation over dinner, and pretending not to notice the way he glanced at his phone when he thought she wasn't looking. But every moment was calculated. She paid close attention to his schedule, noting when he would be out of the house and for how long. She made small adjustments to their accounts, moving money into an account under her name and ensuring she had access to the resources she needed. She even reached out to an attorney, framing her questions as hypothetical to better understand her options. Evan, for his part, seemed blissfully unaware. He carried on with his plans, taking calls from Sophia in hushed tones and preparing for his next trip to Sao Paulo. His confidence was infuriating, but it also gave Margaret the advantage. She thought back to the confrontation in his office, the way he had dismissed her anger, the way he had smirked as though she were powerless to stop him. He had underestimated her then, and he was still underestimating her now. Margaret had spent her entire marriage supporting Evan, putting his needs before her own and trusting him to do right by her. But Evan had shown his true colors, and Margaret was done playing the role of the loyal, forgiving wife. As she sat in the quiet of the house, her plan began to take shape. Evan had made a career out of calculating risks and exploiting opportunities. Now, Margaret was about to beat him at his own game. She thought about the years of resentment that had built up, the little ways Evan had dismissed her contributions and taken her for granted. She thought about the life she had given up to help him build his empire, only to watch him hand it over to someone else. Margaret had always been the one to keep the peace, to smooth over the rough edges of their life, to ensure everything looked perfect from the outside. But now, she was done pretending. Evan believed he held all the power, but Margaret had one advantage he couldn't take away. She knew him. She knew his habits, his weaknesses, and his blind spots, and she was ready to use them against him. By the time Evan returned from his next trip, Margaret's plan was fully formed. She greeted him with a smile, her demeanor calm and composed. But behind her eyes, there was a fire he hadn't seen before, a determination that would soon turn his carefully constructed world upside down. Evan had spent years controlling the narrative, shaping their life to suit his needs, and dismissing Margaret as little more than a supporting player. But the game had changed, and Margaret was no longer willing to play by his rules. For the first time in weeks, Margaret felt a sense of control, a calm resolve that steadied her nerves. Evan had made the mistake of underestimating her, and now, he was going to learn just how wrong he had been. Margaret Brooks had always been methodical. It was a skill she'd honed over decades of running a household and supporting Evan's career. Now, that skill was being tested like never before. Every moment of the last few weeks had been spent planning, calculating, and ensuring that her next steps left no room for error. Evan had underestimated her. He thought she'd sit idly by while he drained their accounts, funneled their assets into his own name, and built a future with Sophia. But Margaret wasn't going to let that happen. Her first task was securing her own financial safety. Over the course of several weeks, she moved money out of their joint accounts. She transferred small amounts each time, careful not to trigger any alerts or suspicions. Evan rarely paid attention to the details of their finances. He considered them too mundane for someone as big picture as he fancied himself to be. By the time she was finished, Margaret had stashed away enough to ensure she wouldn't be left with nothing. But money was only part of the equation. Margaret knew Evan's arrogance would push him to retaliate if she tried to leave him. He'd threatened her once already, promising to drag her through court and leave her destitute if she fought back. That moment had been the turning point for Margaret. The thought of self-defense had crept into her mind that night, unbidden but undeniable. At first, it felt like a distant possibility, an idea born out of desperation. But as she listened to Evan's threats, saw the ease with which he dismissed her as though she were a problem to be solved rather than a person, that distant thought grew closer. Margaret began subtly rearranging the house, making changes so minor that Evan wouldn't notice, but that would serve her later. She placed certain objects in strategic spots, ensuring they would support her story if the need arose. Every adjustment was deliberate, reinforcing the picture of her routine and presence in their home. These changes weren't obvious or disruptive, but they gave Margaret a quiet sense of control. She was preparing for the inevitable confrontation, ensuring that when the time came, the narrative would lean in her favor. She documented everything, creating a timeline of events that painted a picture of a woman living in fear. Each time Evan came home late, each hushed phone call, every careless comment about how he'd soon be free, Margaret recorded it all. She photographed receipts, saved copies of texts, and even wrote down key details in a private journal. Her outward demeanor remained unchanged. She smiled when Evan walked through the door, made polite conversation over dinner, and nodded along as he talked about work. If he noticed her quiet resolve, he didn't show it. His arrogance blinded him, convincing him that Margaret was too weak, too naive to do anything about his plans. One evening, Evan returned from Brazil with a smug smile on his face and a suitcase filled with gifts. None of them were for Margaret. She caught a glimpse of a necklace box as he unpacked, likely another token for Sophia. Margaret didn't say a word, but she couldn't stop herself from listening in later when Evan stepped into his office for a phone call. Just a little longer, and we'll have everything we need, Evan said, his voice low and confident. Margaret's chest tightened. We. He wasn't even hiding it anymore. The words confirmed everything she already knew, but hearing them still felt like a punch to the gut. Evan wasn't just leaving her. He was planning a whole new life with Sophia, and he was taking everything with him. That night, Margaret didn't sleep. She sat in the dark, staring at the faint glow of the city lights outside, her mind racing. Her emotions churned: anger, betrayal, heartbreak. But beneath it all, there was a strange sense of calm. She had already made her decision. Now, it was just a matter of timing. Margaret's preparations continued in the days that followed. She moved through her routines with the same precision as always, but now every action had a purpose. Each moment with Evan felt like a performance, carefully rehearsed to keep him from suspecting anything. She paid close attention to his schedule, noting when he would be out of the house and for how long. She rehearsed her story, practicing her tone and body language. If anyone asked, she wanted her words to feel genuine, her fear believable. But just as Margaret felt like she was gaining control, Evan threw an unexpected wrench into her plans. One evening, as they sat at opposite ends of the dining table, Evan casually announced that he was canceling his next trip to Brazil. "I've got everything lined up," he said, pouring himself another glass of wine. "No point in rushing back when I can handle things from here." Margaret froze for a split second before forcing a smile. "That's great," she said evenly, though her mind was already racing. Evan staying home was the last thing she needed. His trips gave her time and space to finalize her preparations without worrying about his presence. With him in the house, she'd have to be even more careful. The days that followed were tense. Evan's presence was suffocating, his confidence infuriating. He moved through the house like a man who believed he'd already won, oblivious to the storm brewing right under his nose. Margaret adjusted her plans, working faster to ensure everything was in place. She made minor changes to the house, removing any items that could contradict her story. She updated her journal with new entries, documenting her supposed fear of Evan and his temper. But the most critical part of her plan was ensuring she had control over their shared narrative. Evan had spent years controlling the story of their marriage, shaping it to suit his needs. Now, Margaret was taking it back. Late one night, as Evan slept soundly beside her, Margaret stared at the ceiling, her mind clear and focused. She thought about the years she had spent supporting him, the sacrifices she had made, the trust she had placed in him. She thought about Sophia, lounging by some pool in Sao Paulo, waiting for the life Margaret had helped build to fall into her lap. Evan had underestimated her. He thought she was weak, passive, incapable of fighting back. But he was wrong. Margaret's heart pounded as she made a mental checklist of everything she'd prepared. The money she had secured, the documentation she had gathered, the stage she had set. It was all in place. Now, all she needed was the right moment. The house was quiet, but Margaret's mind was racing. Each hour felt like a countdown, each interaction with Evan a reminder of what he had taken from her. But soon, the waiting would be over, and Margaret would take back control of her life in the only way she could. Evan's arrogance had been his greatest weapon, but it was about to become his greatest weakness. And when the time came, Margaret would be ready. On the night of March 8, 2023, Margaret Brooks felt a quiet certainty settle over her. Dinner had been prepared like any other night, a carefully balanced routine that Margaret had perfected over the years. Tonight, it was chicken marsala, Evan's favorite. She plated it with roasted vegetables, making sure everything looked perfect. But beneath the veneer of calm, her hands trembled slightly, though she masked it well. Evan sat at the head of the dining table, scrolling through his phone while occasionally picking at his meal. Margaret sat opposite him, her movements slow and deliberate. She watched him with a practiced neutrality, forcing herself to remain composed. For weeks, her mind had been racing toward this moment, and now it was here. The silence between them was oppressive. Evan broke it occasionally with idle comments about work, real estate deals, or opportunities on the horizon. Margaret nodded when appropriate, keeping her responses short. "Things are lining up better than I expected," Evan said as he reached for his wine glass. His voice carried the same confidence it always did, but to Margaret, it sounded hollow. "That's good," she replied evenly. Evan didn't notice her clipped tone. He rarely noticed anything about her these days unless it served him directly. He talked about his plans with a smug satisfaction, oblivious to the storm brewing just across the table. Margaret didn't push back. She didn't need to. Her anger simmered just beneath the surface, but she knew better than to show it. After dinner, Evan stood and carried his plate to the sink without a word. He poured himself a glass of bourbon and retreated to his office, shutting the door behind him. Margaret watched him go, her heart pounding in her chest. The house fell silent, save for the occasional creak of the hardwood floors. Margaret remained seated at the table for a moment, gathering herself. Then, with deliberate slowness, she stood and followed him. The light spilling out from under Evan's office door guided her steps. She paused for a moment outside, listening to the faint sound of his chair creaking as he leaned back. She tightened her grip on the door handle and pushed it open without knocking. Evan glanced up, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. He sat behind his desk, a tumbler of bourbon in one hand, his laptop glowing in front of him. "Margaret, what is it now?" he asked, his tone sharp. She stepped into the room, her movements calm and measured. "We need to talk." Evan sighed, setting his glass down. "We've already talked. What more is there to say?" Margaret didn't flinch. She had been rehearsing this moment in her mind for weeks. "You've lied to me for years, Evan," she began, her voice steady. "You've cheated, stolen, and planned to leave me with nothing. And now you think you can just walk away without consequences?" Evan leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Margaret, we've been over this. I deserve to be happy. You always make everything so dramatic." Her jaw tightened, but she didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stepped closer to the desk, her eyes locking onto his. "You don't even deny it," she said quietly. "Why would I?" Evan replied, spreading his hands. "You've already figured it out, haven't you? But let's not kid ourselves, Margaret. You didn't build this life. I did. I took the risks. I made the deals. You were just along for the ride." His words were like a slap to the face. Margaret's hands clenched into fists at her sides, but she forced herself to remain composed. "After everything I've done for you," she said, her voice trembling with barely contained anger, "you think I don't matter? That I'm disposable?" Evan chuckled, shaking his head. "You're not disposable, Margaret. You're just not part of the plan anymore." The cold indifference in his voice made her stomach churn. She wanted to scream, to throw the glass of bourbon in his hand across the room. But instead, she took a slow, deep breath and stepped back. "Fine," she said quietly, "if that's how you feel." She turned and walked out of the office, shutting the door behind her. Margaret climbed the stairs to their bedroom, her hands shaking as she reached the top. Once inside, she closed the door softly and sat on the edge of the bed. The confrontation played over and over in her mind, each word cutting deeper than the last. Evan had no remorse, no guilt, only smug confidence that he had already won. Margaret stared at her hands, her breathing shallow as she fought to contain her emotions. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, but nothing could have prepared her for the raw cruelty of his words. He didn't just want to leave her. He wanted to destroy her. She sat there for what felt like hours, the silence of the house pressing down on her. Slowly, her trembling stopped, and her breathing steadied. The pain she felt began to harden into something else, something colder and more focused. Margaret stood and began moving through the house with quiet determination. She checked the subtle changes she had made earlier in the week, ensuring everything was just as she intended. Every adjustment had been deliberate, a step toward regaining control over the narrative that Evan had tried to dominate. As she moved through the spaces they shared, Margaret felt a strange sense of focus. Her actions were careful and precise, each one reinforcing the story she had built in her mind. Nothing was out of place, and everything served its purpose. She returned to her bedroom and sat at her vanity, rehearsing her story in the mirror. Her voice trembled as she practiced the lines she would say, her face twisting with a mixture of fear and anguish. She repeated the words over and over until they sounded natural, until she believed them herself. The hours ticked by, the house eerily quiet except for the occasional creak of the floorboards. Margaret moved like a ghost, her steps light and purposeful. She checked the locks on the doors, ensured her belongings were in their proper places, and reviewed the evidence she had gathered over the weeks. By the time the first rays of dawn began to filter through the curtains, Margaret felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. She had done everything she could to prepare. Now, all that was left was to wait. Downstairs, Evan remained in his office, likely asleep in his chair with an empty glass of bourbon beside him. He had no idea what was coming, no clue how much his arrogance and cruelty had cost him. Margaret lay down on the bed, staring at the ceiling as the light grew brighter. She thought about the life they had built together, the sacrifices she had made, and the betrayal that had shattered it all. Evan had underestimated her, dismissed her as weak and powerless. But Margaret knew better. The tension in the house was palpable, a quiet storm brewing beneath the surface. And soon, everything would come to a head. The day ahead would change everything, and Margaret was ready. Margaret Brooks had spent hours pacing in the quiet stillness of the house. The faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards were the only sounds that accompanied her thoughts. Upstairs, the bedroom felt suffocating. She had gone there to lie down but couldn't bear the stillness. Her mind raced, looping through the events of the evening. Dinner had been tense, as it always was these days. Margaret had set the table carefully, cooking a meal she knew Evan liked, not because she cared about his comfort anymore, but because routine helped her stay grounded. She watched him across the table, his every move, how he tapped on his phone, occasionally glancing up to make half-hearted small talk. He was distracted, as he so often was, and utterly indifferent to the weight pressing down on her. After dinner, Evan had retreated to his office, as he always did, with a glass of bourbon in hand. Margaret could still hear the faint clink of the ice as he swirled it around the glass. He didn't say goodnight or ask her what she planned to do with her evening. He never did. His presence in the house had become more like background noise, something she endured rather than interacted with. She let an hour pass before heading downstairs, her footsteps light on the wooden stairs. The air felt heavy as she approached his office, her palms slightly damp. Margaret had spent weeks imagining how this moment might unfold, and now it was here. The door to his office was slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling into the hallway. She pushed it open slowly, her heart pounding. Evan sat at his desk, his back partially turned toward her as he leaned over his laptop. A lamp cast a warm glow over the room, and his glass of bourbon was nearly empty. He didn't notice her at first, his attention fixed on the screen. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She opened her mouth to say something, but the words caught. When he finally glanced up, his expression was one of mild irritation. "Margaret, what now?" The sharpness of his tone made her hesitate. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind, but now that it was here, her thoughts felt scrambled. "You lied to me," she said, her voice quieter than she had intended. Evan leaned back in his chair, his annoyance giving way to something colder, harder. "We've already been over this," he said, gesturing dismissively with his hand. "I don't know what you want from me." Margaret stared at him, her mind racing. Every cruel word he'd spoken, every lie he'd told, every betrayal she'd uncovered. All of it rose to the surface. Evan's smirk deepened, as if her silence confirmed something he already believed about her. "This is why nothing works between us," he continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "You're always clinging to the past. Just move on already. You'll figure it out. You always do." The dismissiveness in his tone cut deeper than any insult. Margaret felt her hands clench at her sides. She took a step forward, her voice shaking with barely contained fury. "Do you even care about what you've done? About what you've taken from me?" Evan shrugged, draining the last of his bourbon. "Not everything is about you, Margaret," he said. "Some things are just better left behind." That was it. The moment everything inside Margaret shattered. She acted without thinking, a surge of raw emotion driving her forward, and when it was over, the room was filled with an unbearable silence. Evan wouldn't hurt her again. The hours after felt like a blur. Margaret found herself sitting at the dining table, staring at the faint glow of the city lights outside the window. She replayed the argument over and over in her mind, each word cutting deeper than the last. Evan's arrogance, his cold indifference, it had all been too much. Her hands trembled as she thought about what had happened. She wasn't even sure how much time had passed since she'd left the office, but the weight of it all pressed down on her like a tidal wave. Her thoughts were fragmented, darting between the past and the present as she tried to piece together what came next. Margaret stood and began moving through the house, her steps slow and deliberate. She checked the adjustments she had made earlier in the week, ensuring everything was in its place. It wasn't just about the physical objects, it was about telling the right story. The office, now dark and silent, bore the marks of a confrontation. Margaret scanned the room, her eyes landing on the chair, the desk, the scattered papers. She felt a strange detachment as she moved through the space, her hands steady as she made small, deliberate adjustments. She didn't rush. Every movement was careful, methodical. When she was done, she stepped back and surveyed the scene. The room told a story now, one that aligned with what she would say when the time came. Margaret wiped her hands on a kitchen towel, her breath slow and even as she prepared for what was next. In the early hours of the morning, Margaret dialed 911. Her voice trembled as she explained what had happened, her words halting and laced with emotion. "My husband," she stammered. He came at me. I didn't have a choice." The dispatcher's voice was calm and measured, asking her to stay on the line until help arrived. Margaret followed the instructions, clutching the phone tightly as she paced the living room. Her breathing was ragged, and she let the tears come freely, knowing they would only reinforce the image she needed to project. When the police arrived, the house was eerily quiet. Margaret greeted them at the door, her face pale and tear-streaked. She led them to the office, her hands trembling as she gestured toward the desk. Evan's body was slumped forward, the scene exactly as she had left it. Her explanation was simple. An argument had turned violent, and she had acted in self-defense. She described the confrontation in vivid detail, her voice breaking at just the right moments. At first, the officers seemed to accept her account. The scene matched her description well enough, and her emotional state appeared genuine. But as the investigation progressed, the details began to unravel. Forensic evidence told a different story. Investigators noted inconsistencies between Margaret's account and the physical evidence at the scene, raising questions about whether the events had unfolded as she claimed. In the days that followed, further evidence came to light, deepening their suspicions. Financial records revealed a series of unusual transfers Margaret had made in the weeks leading up to the incident. Searches on her devices raised even more questions, with terms like how to defend yourself in an argument and self-defense laws appearing prominently in her history. As detectives pieced together the timeline, Margaret's story began to crumble. What initially appeared to be a tragic act of self-defense now looked far more calculated. Margaret was arrested a week later. She didn't resist, though her face betrayed the weight of her emotions. She maintained her innocence, insisting that she had no choice, that Evan had forced her hand. The trial that followed captivated the public. Prosecutors painted Margaret as a cunning and manipulative woman who had planned her actions for weeks. They presented evidence of her financial preparations, the changes she had made around the house, and the damning search history that pointed to premeditation. Margaret's defense team argued that years of emotional abuse and betrayal had pushed her to the breaking point. They described her as a woman trapped in a toxic marriage, desperate to protect herself in a moment of fear. But the jury wasn't swayed. After weeks of testimony, Margaret was found guilty, and the court's decision ensured she would spend the rest of her life reflecting on the choices that had led her there. In her final statement, Margaret spoke through tears. "I wasn't trying to hurt anyone," she said. "I just wanted to protect myself. Evan took everything from me, and I couldn't let him take what little I had left." In the aftermath of Evan's death, Sophia returned to Sao Paulo. Left with no financial support and a ruined reputation, she claimed she had been unaware that Evan was married. But few believed her. The Brooks estate became mired in legal battles. Without Evan or Margaret to maintain it, their empire crumbled, the assets tied up in disputes that would take years to resolve. Neither Margaret nor Sophia walked away with anything. The story of Evan and Margaret Brooks became a cautionary tale. What had once seemed like a life of power and success was revealed to be a fragile facade, shattered by greed, betrayal, and revenge. The legacy they left behind wasn't one of triumph but of tragedy, a stark reminder of what happens when ambition and deception consume everything in their path.